The bar reeked of stale beer, sweat, and desperation. Neon signs buzzed faintly, casting flickering light over the cheap wood and sticky floors. It wasn't a place Sarah and I would normally go. Too loud, too messy. But tonight wasn't a normal night. Her text from earlier was still open on my phone. Out with friends. Don't wait up. It was casual, like hundreds of texts before it, but something about it gnawed at me. She'd been distant lately, her touch colder, her smiles rarer. I told myself it was just work stress, that things between us were still solid. But now, standing in that darkened room, I wasn't so sure. I pushed through the crowd, my shoulders brushing against strangers who barely noticed me. The music thudded in my chest, a deep, pulsing rhythm that seemed to match my quickening heartbeat. My eyes darted around the room, scanning for her familiar silhouette. And then I saw her. She was on the dance floor, bathed in dim, shifting light, her golden hair catching flashes of red and blue. But she wasn't alone. He was there. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up just enough to show off forearms marked with faint tattoos. He had that kind of effortless confidence I hated instantly, the kind that made you feel small just by standing next to him. They moved together like they'd done this 100 times before. His hands rested low on her waist, pulling her close as their hips swayed in perfect harmony. Her head tilted back slightly, laughing at something he whispered in her ear, a sound I hadn't heard from her in weeks. I froze, my feet rooted to the sticky floor, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. Was this real? Was I seeing what I thought I was seeing? His hands slid lower, fingers brushing the hem of her skirt. She didn't stop him. She didn't pull away. A cold rage began to bubble in my chest, mixing with something even worse. Doubt. Had I missed the signs? Had she been slipping away from me all along, and I was just too blind to notice? I forced myself forward, pushing through the throng of people until I was only feet away from them. My voice broke free, sharp and angry, cutting through the heavy bass of the music. What the hell is going on here? The words hung in the air, louder than I intended, and heads turned toward us. Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her head slowly, her expression calm, almost detached. "John," she said, her tone light, as if she'd just run into me at the grocery store. "I promised him this dance. You don't mind if I finish, do you?" I blinked, struggling to process what she had just said. Her voice was so calm, so casual, it made my blood run cold. The man, Mark, as I would later learn, turned to face me fully, his smirk widening. He was older than me, maybe by 5 years, but his confidence made him seem invincible. One of his hands slid daringly higher, his fingers now brushing the curve of her back beneath the hem of her blouse. "You heard the lady," he said, his voice smooth, almost taunting. "She's just having a little fun. No harm, right?" My body tensed, every muscle screaming at me to lunge at him, to rip her away from him, to end this nightmare. But Sarah's eyes locked onto mine, and there was something in them, something cold and defiant, that stopped me. "Sarah?" I managed to say, my voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "Come home. Now." She tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a faint, almost cruel smile. "I think I'll stay," she said, her voice cutting through me like a blade. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My heart pounded in my ears, the music and chatter around us fading into a distant hum. My hands clenched tighter, nails digging into my palms, but I stayed rooted to the spot. Mark smirked again, his hand now resting possessively on her lower back. "Looks like you've got your answer, buddy." I wanted to scream, to fight, to make her see what she was doing to us, to me. But she turned away from me, her attention already back on him, as if I were nothing more than a passing inconvenience. I stumbled backward, the crowd swallowing me up as I left the dance floor. My legs felt heavy, my chest hollow. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that everything I thought I had, everything I thought I knew, was gone. I drove home in silence that night, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The city blurred around me. neon signs and streetlights bleeding into each other, as if the world outside reflected the chaos inside my head. My mind replayed the scene over and over, her calm defiance, his smug grin, the way their bodies fit together like a puzzle I no longer belonged to. How did we get here? Once home, the house felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like a stranger in your own life. I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, trying to piece together the moments that led to this unraveling. Sarah and I had been married for 6 years. I remembered the day I proposed, a crisp autumn afternoon in Central Park. She had cried, her hands shaking as she said yes. Back then, her eyes lit up when she looked at me, like I was her whole world. But lately, those eyes had been distant, distracted. There were excuses about late nights at work, new hobbies that didn't include me, and a growing silence that felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. I told myself it was just a phase, that every couple goes through rough patches. But now, sitting alone in the dark, the weight of reality settled on my chest like a boulder. She didn't even hesitate. That's what haunted me the most. When I confronted her, she didn't flinch, didn't stammer, didn't show even a flicker of guilt. Instead, she stayed with him, as if my presence meant nothing. I glanced at the framed photo on the mantel, the two of us on our wedding day. Her smile was radiant, her hands gripping mine like she'd never let go. I couldn't reconcile that woman with the one I'd seen tonight. I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over her number. I wanted to call her, to demand answers, to ask her how she could do this to us. But what would she say? Would she even pick up? Instead, I opened a bottle of whiskey and poured myself a drink. Then another. The warmth of the alcohol did little to numb the ache in my chest. As the hours passed, my thoughts turned darker. Maybe this was my fault. I wasn't perfect. I'd been controlling at times, too focused on work, too blind to see her slipping away. Had I pushed her into the arms of someone else? Or was this just who she was now? The clock struck 3 a.m., and still, I sat there, trapped in a loop of doubt, anger, and heartbreak. Couldn't sleep, not with the image of her and Mark burned into my mind. I knew I couldn't let this go. I had to understand why. Was she bored? Unhappy? Or had she simply stopped loving me? But beneath the hurt, another emotion stirred. A cold, simmering rage. Mark. The way he smirked at me. The way he touched her as if I didn't exist. He didn't just take my wife. He humiliated me. I downed the rest of my drink, the burn of it sharpening my focus. If he thought he could walk into my life and destroy everything I'd built, he was wrong. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to let her go without a fight. The next morning was thick with an oppressive quiet. The kind that settles into the corners of the house, making every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind sound deafening. Sarah hadn't come home. I checked my phone a dozen times, hoping for a message or a missed call. Nothing. I wasn't sure what I expected. A confession? An apology? Something to explain how we had gone from partners, bound by vows, to strangers living in a fractured reality. But instead, there was only silence. Determined not to drown in my own thoughts, I decided to learn more about Mark. If I was going to fight for Sarah, I needed to know who I was fighting against. I remembered the way he carried himself in the bar. Self-assured, cocky, untouchable. He was older, maybe mid-40s, with that effortless charm that made people gravitate toward him. A man who looked like he was used to winning. It didn't take long to find him. Social media makes people careless with their privacy. His Instagram was a shrine to his ego. Photos of him in tailored suits, standing beside luxury cars, or on yachts with glasses of champagne in hand, always smiling that same smug smile. The captions were worse. Winning isn't everything. It's the only thing. Or some men watch, others take. Every post made my stomach churn. He wasn't just a man. He was a predator, someone who thrived on taking what didn't belong to him. Digging deeper, I found his LinkedIn. Mark Spencer, CEO of some high-end real estate firm in downtown Los Angeles. A man with money, power, and connections. The kind of man who could buy his way out of any trouble. I wondered how he and Sarah had met. Did he see her at a coffee shop and decide she was his next conquest? Or had she sought him out, tired of the monotony of our life together? The thought of her reaching out to him, choosing him, sent a sharp pain through my chest. Around noon, my phone buzzed. For a moment, my heart leapt, thinking it was Sarah. But it was a text from an unknown number. "You don't scare me. Maybe it's time to walk away, John. She's happier now." My blood ran cold. It was him. I stared at the screen, my grip tightening around the phone until my knuckles turned white. How did he get my number? And what gave him the audacity to text me, as if I were the intruder in my own marriage? My first instinct was to respond with every curse and threat I could muster, but I stopped myself. That's what he wanted, a reaction. He wanted to prove he was in control, that I was nothing more than an obstacle in his game. Instead, I took a deep breath and typed back, "You're just a distraction. She'll see through you soon enough." It was a lie. I wasn't sure Sarah would see through him. Not after last night. But I needed him to know I wasn't giving up. Hours passed, but the anger didn't fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him touching her, smirking at me, daring me to stop him. I paced the living room, my thoughts spiraling. How could I fight someone like him? He had money, charm, and most importantly, Sarah's attention. But then it hit me. Mark wasn't invincible. He was just a man. And every man has weaknesses. I pored over his social media and professional profiles for hours, looking for cracks in his perfect facade. Late that evening, I found something. A woman, her name was Jessica, commenting on his photos. Her words weren't flirtatious. They were bitter, almost venomous. "You're a liar, Mark. Do they know the truth about you?" The posts were old, buried under layers of newer content, but they were enough to give me hope. Someone out there had seen his true face. Someone who might help me expose him for what he really was. By midnight, I had found her profile. Jessica Monroe. Her posts were private, but her profile picture showed a younger woman, maybe in her late 20s, with sharp eyes and a tense smile. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the message button. Would she respond? Would she even care? Finally, I typed, "Hi, Jessica. My name is John. I believe you know Mark Spencer. I think he's trying to destroy my marriage. Can you help me?" I hit send and stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The message felt desperate, almost pathetic. But I didn't care. I needed an edge. For the first time that day, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. Determination. If Mark wanted to play games, I was ready. The reply came faster than I expected. My phone buzzed just as I was pouring another drink, the amber liquid catching the dim light in the kitchen. I set the glass down, my hands shaking slightly as I unlocked the phone. Her response was short, but it hit like a bullet. What did he do now? I stared at the message, reading it over and over. The way she phrased it, "What did he do now?" spoke volumes. She knew. She had been through something, maybe worse than what I was dealing with. My fingers moved quickly, typing back, "He's going after my wife. I don't know how they met, but I walked in on them last night. He's trying to ruin my life." I hesitated before sending it, but only for a second. What was there to lose? My pride was already in shreds. Her response came almost instantly. "Typical. He picks women who aren't his, like it's a sport. What do you want from me?" I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of this conversation. I had no idea who Jessica really was or how far she was willing to go. But right now, she was my only lead. I need to know who he really is, how he operates, anything I can use to get him out of her life. There was a pause longer this time. I imagined her on the other side of the screen, weighing her options, deciding whether she wanted to reopen wounds that might never have fully healed. Finally, her response appeared. "He's a manipulator. Charming but dangerous. He makes you feel like you're the only person in the world that matters. But it's all a lie. He used me for over a year, then discarded me when I started asking questions." I felt a surge of anger on her behalf. This man had left a trail of destruction behind him, and now he was coming for me, for Sarah. Why didn't you expose him? I asked, my frustration bleeding into the message. Her reply was blunt. Because he's smart. He covers his tracks. And when I tried to warn people, no one believed me. They saw the cars, the suits, the smile, and they thought I was just bitter. But I'll tell you everything I know. I felt a flicker of hope, faint but real. Maybe, just maybe, I had found someone who could help me turn the tables. Jessica called me that night. Her voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of bitterness that seemed permanently etched into her tone. I met Mark at a networking event, she began. He swept me off my feet, told me I was special, different. He made me feel like I mattered in a way no one else ever had. But it was all calculated. He's a predator, John. He doesn't just take women, he takes control. He makes you question everything about yourself until you're dependent on him. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I thought of Sarah, how distant she'd been lately, how easily she had chosen to stay with him last night. He has a pattern, Jessica continued. He picks women who are in relationships, women he sees as a challenge. It's not just about the woman. It's about humiliating the man. He likes the power. And if you confront him, he'll make you look like the bad guy. He's done it before. My jaw tightened. This wasn't just an affair. This was a game to Mark, and I was the unwitting opponent. Do you have proof? I asked. She hesitated. Not much. He's careful. But I kept some texts, photos, and a few voice messages. Enough to show his patterns. Maybe make Sarah see the truth. That was all I needed to hear. Send me everything you have, I said. I need to stop him. She sighed, and for the first time, her voice softened. Be careful, John. He doesn't like losing. If he feels cornered, he'll come after you. And he won't play fair. The line went silent after that, but her warning stayed with me. I sat there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Mark wasn't just a man chasing after my wife. He was a master manipulator. Someone who thrived on chaos and control. But now I had a weapon. Jessica's truth was messy and imperfect, but it was a start. I opened the folder of evidence she sent me, a mix of screenshots and voice recordings. One message from Mark stood out immediately. You know I always win, right? Just let it happen. The words made my skin crawl, but they also fueled the fire inside me. Mark thought he was untouchable. He thought he could walk into my life, take what was mine, and leave me broken. He was wrong. The next day, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The shock and helplessness from 2 nights ago had hardened into something sharper, something dangerous. If Mark wanted a game, I'd play, but I wouldn't play by his rules. I spent the morning combing through Jessica's evidence. It was a mess of cryptic texts and subtle manipulation, but it all painted a damning picture. Mark didn't just seduce women, he dismantled lives. One text read, "You'll thank me one day for showing you who you really are." Another, "If he cared, he'd fight for you. But he won't because he's weak." I could hear his voice in my head as I read them, smug and self-assured, the same tone he used when he smirked at me in that bar. By mid-afternoon, I decided I couldn't wait for Sarah to come home. She was still at work, or at least that's what she told me when I texted her that morning. But I knew Mark was nearby. His Instagram stories showed him at a cafe just a few blocks away. I stood outside the cafe for a few minutes, watching through the glass. He was seated by the window, sipping a coffee and scrolling on his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. The casual arrogance of it made my blood boil. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and walked in. The bell above the door jingled softly, but he didn't look up. "Mark," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. He glanced up, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. He didn't even look surprised. "John," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Didn't expect to see you here. Coffee?" I ignored the chair he motioned to, standing over him instead. "We need to talk." "About Sarah?" He tilted his head, feigning innocence. "She's quite something, isn't she?" The casual way he said her name, as if she were a prize he'd already claimed, made my hands clench into fists. But I held myself back. Barely. "Stay away from her," I said, my voice low but firm. He laughed. A short, sharp sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Stay away? John, she's not a piece of property. She's a grown woman who can make her own decisions. And, if I'm being honest, she seems pretty happy with the ones she's making." The smugness in his tone made me see red. But instead of lashing out, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the folder Jessica had sent me and slid the screen across the table. His smile faltered for the first time. "What's this?" he asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of unease. "Your history," I said. "Jessica says hi, by the way." His eyes flicked over the screen, scanning the messages and photos. For a moment, I saw something in his expression. Annoyance, maybe even fear, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He pushed the phone back toward me. "So, you've been talking to my ex. That's cute. But you think this changes anything? Sarah isn't going to believe some bitter woman's lies. She knows me. She trusts me. She trusted me first," I snapped. "And yet, here we are." His smirk returned, colder this time. "Face it, John. You already lost. You're just too stubborn to admit it." The weight of his words hit me, but instead of backing down, I leaned closer. "You don't scare me, Mark. And you're not as invincible as you think. People like you always slip up. Always." He met my gaze, his smile faltering again, just for a second. Then he leaned back and shrugged. "You're free to try, John. But I'd be careful if I were you. Pushing too hard can have consequences." The threat hung in the air between us, subtle but unmistakable. I stared him down, refusing to let him see any hint of fear. Finally, I turned and walked out of the cafe, my heart pounding. Outside, the cool air hit me like a slap, and I realized my hands were shaking. But it wasn't fear that coursed through me. It was adrenaline. Mark thought he had the upper hand, but his confidence was his weakness. He didn't see me as a threat, which made me dangerous. I had no intention of backing down. The next few days were a blur of strategy and surveillance. I didn't go back to work. I told my boss I was sick, but in truth, I was consumed by the need to figure out my next move. My life had become a battlefield, and Mark was the enemy standing in the way of everything I had built with Sarah. Jessica and I stayed in contact. Every conversation revealed more about the man I was up against. She told me about his manipulative tactics, how he played people against each other, and how he always seemed to come out unscathed, no matter the wreckage he left behind. "He's smart, John," she warned me one evening over the phone. "You have to be 2 steps ahead of him or he'll bury you. He always does." But even predators like Mark had their weaknesses. I just had to find them. Late one night, I decided to push my luck. I created a fake social media account, posing as a woman. The profile was carefully constructed. An attractive face borrowed from a stock photo, a vague but enticing bio, and enough posts to seem real. I followed Mark and waited. It didn't take long. By the next afternoon, he had followed back. A direct message popped up not long after. "Hey there. New to the city." I stared at the screen, a mix of disgust and satisfaction bubbling inside me. He was predictable. The conversation started innocently enough. He asked the usual questions, where I was from, what brought me to LA. But soon, his messages turned flirtatious, then bold. He didn't waste time. Within hours, he was sending photos of himself, smiling in front of his car, lounging by a pool with a drink in hand. The messages were laced with charm, but they reeked of arrogance. I saved everything. Screenshots of the messages, the photos, even the timestamps. It wasn't enough to take him down, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Sarah remained distant. She came home late, often claiming she was working overtime or meeting up with friends. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed to be sure I had the upper hand before I made my move. But the silence between us was deafening. The woman I had once shared everything with now felt like a stranger. I wanted to ask her if she still loved me, if she still believed in the vows we had taken. But I was afraid of the answer. One evening, She came home earlier than usual. She walked into the living room, where I was pretending to watch TV, and sat down across from me. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm. My heart sank. Those words were never good. "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She hesitated, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "About us. About everything." I turned off the TV and faced her fully, bracing myself. "Go on. I know things haven't been great between us lately," she began, avoiding my eyes. "And I know I haven't been as present as I should be. But it's not because I don't care about you." Her words felt like a slap. Care? After everything I had seen, everything I knew, she still thought this was about caring? "Then what is it, Sarah?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've checked out of this marriage." She flinched but quickly recovered. "It's not that simple. I've been confused. About us, about myself. And then Mark." Her voice trailed off, and her face turned pale. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "What about Mark?" She finally met my eyes, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with, the vulnerability, the honesty. He made me feel seen, like I mattered again. "But I swear, John, nothing has happened." "Not really. Not really," I repeated, my voice rising. "I saw the way he touched you, Sarah. I saw the way you let him." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I don't know why I let it happen. Maybe I was angry at you, or maybe I just wanted to feel wanted again. But it's over. I'm ending it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her, but the scars of the last few days ran too deep. "You think it's that easy?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. "You think you can just walk away from him?" "Mark doesn't let people walk away, Sarah. He doesn't lose." She frowned, her brows knitting together in confusion. "What are you talking about?" I reached for my phone and opened the folder of evidence I had collected, the messages from Jessica, the screenshots of his flirtations, the voice recordings. I handed it to her. "Take a good look," I said. "This is who he really is. And this is what he does." She scrolled through the files, her face going pale as realization dawned. "Oh my God," she whispered. "How did you get all this?" "It doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that you see the truth. Mark doesn't care about you. He never did. You were just another game to him." Her hands trembled as she handed the phone back to me. "What do we do?" It was the first time in weeks that she had said "we." It was a small victory, but it felt like a lifeline. "We fight," I said simply. "But first you need to cut him off completely. No messages, no meetings, nothing. Can you do that?" She nodded, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "Yes, I'll do it." But as she stood to leave the room, my gut told me this wasn't over. Mark wouldn't let go that easily, and neither would I. The following day, Sarah sent Mark a message ending things. She showed me the text before hitting send. "Mark, this is over. Don't contact me again. I'm choosing my husband." It was simple, direct. I thought it would close the door, but I knew better than to think Mark would walk away without a fight. An hour later, her phone buzzed. She hesitated before looking at it, her face pale. "Is it him?" I asked. She nodded, then handed me the phone. The message was chilling in its simplicity. "You'll regret this." My fists clenched. He wasn't backing off. If anything, he was doubling down. "We need to be careful," I told her. "Block his number. Block him everywhere." She nodded again, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Mark's grip on her wasn't just emotional, it was psychological. That night, I stayed up, waiting for something to happen. Every sound outside, every shadow made me tense. Mark wasn't just a man scorned. He was a predator, and predators don't retreat quietly. At 2 a.m., a car slowed down outside our house. The headlights lingered, then disappeared into the darkness. I stepped outside, but the street was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching, waiting. This wasn't over. The next few days were unsettlingly quiet. Mark hadn't tried to contact Sarah again, but I could feel the tension hanging in the air. It was like we were waiting for something or someone to make the next move. But then came the text. It wasn't from Mark. It was from an unknown number. The message was short but unsettling. You think you've won, but you're just a pawn in a bigger game. Watch your back. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. This wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. Mark was playing mind games, trying to rattle me, and it was working. I showed Sarah the message. She swallowed hard, her face pale. Do you think he's behind this? I know he is, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. He's trying to intimidate us, make us doubt ourselves. But it won't work. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, footsteps, whispers. Every time I looked out the window, there was nothing but the empty street. It was as if he was there, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was closer than I realized, that his next move was already in play. Then it came. Around midnight, I heard a knock on the door. It was quiet, almost tentative. I went to the peephole, my heart pounding. No one. But there, on the doorstep, was a single rose. A note was tied to it. You can't protect her from me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. This wasn't just a game to him anymore. This was a declaration of war. I showed Sarah the note, her eyes widening in shock. It's getting out of hand. We need to be prepared for anything, I said, trying to keep the fear from my voice. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. And for the first time in days, I felt truly afraid. The rose was the last straw. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Mark wasn't just playing games. He was escalating, turning every interaction into a threat, every gesture into something more sinister. That night, I sat in our living room, staring at the door. I knew something was coming. I could feel it in my bones. Sarah had tried to reassure me, but deep down, we both knew this wasn't going to end quietly. The phone rang at 3 a.m. It wasn't Sarah's phone this time. It was mine. I grabbed it quickly, my heart pounding. John. The voice on the other end said low and calm. You don't know me, but you'll get to know me soon enough. I froze. The voice was unfamiliar, but there was something chilling about it. Who is this? I demanded, my grip tightening on the phone. The question isn't who I am, the voice continued. It's whether or not you'll be able to protect the people you care about. A cold sweat broke out across my back. What do you want? I think you know. But here's the thing, John. There's only so much I can do. I'm just the messenger. But Mark? He's the one who will make your life hell if you don't step aside. I wanted to scream, but I stayed silent, listening. You're already too deep in this, my friend, the voice continued. He's playing you, making you think you're in control. But you're just following the script he wrote for you. And when the time comes, you'll lose everything. I promise you that. The line went dead. I sat there, staring at the phone, unable to process what had just happened. Every warning Mark had given me was starting to make sense. He wasn't just toying with us. He was orchestrating everything, pulling strings from the shadows, using fear and intimidation to get exactly what he wanted. I knew I had to do something. But what? The phone call had shattered whatever semblance of control I had left. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was a war. I turned to Sarah, who had woken up after hearing my voice. What's happening, John? I couldn't lie to her anymore. Mark is going to destroy everything we have unless we stop him. She stood there, eyes wide with terror, but also something else, determination. Then let's stop him. I nodded, though doubt gnawed at me. How could we possibly stop someone like him? Someone who had so much power, so much control? But it wasn't just about stopping him anymore. It was about saving ourselves. The days following the phone call felt like I was walking through a fog. Every moment was filled with a sense of impending doom. Sarah and I barely spoke. Everything I said felt like it would break the fragile trust we were trying to rebuild. But despite the silence between us, there was one thing we both agreed on. We had to fight back. I spent the next few days trying to gather information. I needed more than just messages and threats. I needed to get to the root of Mark's game. I went through every piece of evidence I had, analyzing his patterns, looking for any slip-ups, any weakness I could exploit. But then I found it. One evening, while I was digging through some old files on Sarah's laptop, I stumbled across a conversation that made my stomach drop. It was a message thread between Sarah and Mark, one I hadn't seen before. "I know you're confused, but I'm the one who sees you for who you really are," Mark had written. "John won't ever understand you like I do. He's just a placeholder until I can have you for myself. Please, Mark, I don't want this. It's wrong." Sarah had replied, her words hesitant, unsure. "No one is ever going to love you the way I do. Trust me, Sarah. You'll be mine. Just wait." My hands shook as I read through the thread. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Sarah had been talking to him, had been allowing this manipulation to continue. The entire time I thought we were fighting for our relationship, she had been playing both sides. My mind raced. Was she still in love with him? Was she playing me this whole time, pretending to cut ties with Mark while secretly encouraging him? I felt betrayed not just by Mark, but by her. I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I knew the full extent of her involvement. I needed to see if this was an isolated incident or if she had been lying to me all along. I sat in silence for hours, staring at the screen, fighting the urge to text her. Every time I picked up my phone, I hesitated. Could I really confront her with this, knowing it could destroy everything? But in the back of my mind, a voice kept telling me, "You deserve the truth." That night, when Sarah came home, I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to know if everything I thought I knew was real. "Sarah, we need to talk," I said as soon as she walked through the door. She froze, her eyes darting nervously. "About what?" "About Mark," I replied, my voice steady but my heart pounding. "And about everything you've been hiding." Her face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "I saw the messages, Sarah. I know what's been going on between you two. Don't lie to me." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw something there, fear. But then it shifted to defensiveness. "That's not what you think," she said quickly. "I didn't want it to happen. It's not like that." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "Then explain it to me. Explain why you kept talking to him. Explain why you let him manipulate you." She looked away, avoiding my gaze. I was confused, okay? I was lost, and Mark made me feel like I mattered. "You didn't notice me anymore, John. You didn't care." Her words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her everything I had sacrificed for us, for our future. But instead, I stood there in silence, processing everything she had just said. "So this is my fault?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You think I didn't notice you? That I didn't care? All this time, I've been fighting for us, for our life together. And you were." "I was weak," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "I was stupid, and I should never have let him in. But it was easier to let him make me feel important than to face the truth, that I was losing you." Her words hit me hard. She was right in some ways. I had been distant, consumed with my own fears and frustrations. But this was too much. I didn't know who to trust anymore. "Is there anything else?" I asked, my voice quiet. She hesitated, looking down at the floor. "There's more, John, but I'm scared. I'm scared of what it means for us, for everything we've built." I took a deep breath. I wasn't sure if I was ready for more lies, more secrets. But if this was really the end of everything I thought I knew, then I had to face it. "I need the truth, Sarah," I said, my voice shaking. "All of it." She nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. "I was planning to leave you, John. I thought maybe Mark was right, but I swear I was wrong. I never wanted to hurt you." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in my chest. The woman I loved had almost left me for the very man I was fighting to protect her from. The betrayal stung like 1,000 knives, but now it was clear. The war was far from over. and I wasn't sure if I could win this fight. The truth hung between us like a thick, suffocating fog. Every word Sarah had spoken felt like a betrayal I couldn't undo. Yet here I was, trying to hold on to something that was slipping through my fingers. She was sitting across from me, her face pale, hands trembling. She looked like she wanted to say something, anything, to make it right. But I didn't know if I could let her. I don't know what to say anymore. I told her, my voice hoarse. You almost left me. For him. I didn't know what I was doing. She whispered, her eyes pleading. I was confused, John. I thought maybe it was too late for us. And Mark, he made me feel seen, important. You've been so distant. I thought I needed someone who actually cared. I clenched my jaw, the words cutting deep. It wasn't just that she had spoken to him. It was that she had let herself fall into his manipulation, had allowed him to make her doubt me. But you didn't come to me, Sarah, I said quietly. You didn't talk to me about what was wrong. You just ran to him. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. It felt like every moment I spent looking at her only made the distance between us grow wider. She wasn't the woman I had married anymore, and I wasn't sure if I could ever get back the man I once was. I don't know if I can do this, I said, the weight of everything crashing down. I don't know if I can keep fighting for something that might not be worth fighting for. Please, John, she begged. Please don't give up on us. I know I've hurt you, but I want to fix this. I love you. I felt her words like a punch to the gut. She loved me? Was that true? Or had she simply told me that because she thought it would make everything better? I stood up abruptly, pacing the room. I don't know what love is anymore, Sarah, I admitted. I don't know if what you're telling me is real, or if it's just another lie to get me to forgive you. And I can't keep living like this, constantly second-guessing everything. You don't have to second-guess me, she said, her voice breaking. I swear, I'm done with him. I'm done with all of it. But as soon as she said it, I knew she wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark still had a hold on her, that no matter how many promises she made, he would always be there in the shadows, whispering in her ear, waiting for her to fall back into his trap. I turned to her, my eyes searching hers. How do I know you mean it? I asked, my voice low. How do I know you're not going to go running back to him the moment things get hard? She shook her head, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. I won't. I swear I won't. But I didn't believe her. And that was the moment I realized I couldn't trust her anymore. Not completely. Not the way I had once. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Sarah's betrayal had broken something inside me. The woman I had once loved, the woman I had fought for, was no longer the person I thought she was. And now, I had to decide what to do with this shattered version of our life. But there was something else lurking in the back of my mind. Mark hadn't stopped. I knew it. Whatever was left of our relationship didn't matter to him. He was still coming for me, still coming for her. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep fighting. The days that followed were filled with silence. A thick, suffocating silence that seemed to settle in every corner of our home. Sarah was trying, desperately trying, to prove herself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was broken beyond repair. I didn't know how to look at her anymore. I didn't know how to trust her words or her touch. Every time I caught her looking at me, her eyes filled with remorse, I felt a mixture of anger and sadness I couldn't control. How could she betray me like that? How could she let herself be so easily manipulated by Mark, a man who had never cared about her the way I had? I kept asking myself the same questions, but the answers never came. At night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face. His smile, the way he had touched her in front of me, mocking me, daring me to fight. And every time I tried to imagine a future without him in it, I couldn't. The shadows he cast over our lives were too long. I started doing things I never thought I would do. I began checking Sarah's phone more often, searching for any sign of contact with Mark. I even went so far as to check her social media, combing through every message, every like, looking for any hint of him. But I didn't find anything. Still, I didn't trust her. Not fully. One evening, after another quiet dinner where we barely spoke, Sarah came to me with a proposition. "John, I think it's time we see someone. A counselor. We can't keep going on like this." I looked at her, my eyes cold. "Why? So we can talk about how you almost left me for the guy who's been trying to ruin us? So you can lie to someone else about how sorry you are." Her face fell. She looked like I had slapped her. "I'm not lying, John. I'm trying to make it right. I don't know how else to prove it to you. I don't want to talk to a counselor," I snapped. "What's the point? You've already made your choice. You've already shown me who you really are." She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I had no patience left for apologies or promises. They felt hollow now, empty. And then, as if fate were mocking me, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "I told you she'd come back to me. You don't stand a chance, John. Don't say I didn't warn you." My blood ran cold. It was Mark. Again. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my jacket, stormed out of the house, and drove straight to the address I had traced the number to. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do, but the anger inside me was burning too hot to ignore. When I arrived at the building, a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town, I didn't think. I just acted. I stormed up to the door, knocking with a force that shook the entire frame. The door opened, and there he was. Mark. He smiled, a smug, knowing grin. "John, I didn't think you had the guts to come here. You've been playing games with my life for too long." "Mark," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "And now you're going to pay for it." He stepped aside, letting me into the apartment. "You think I'm scared of you?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. "I've already won, John. Sarah's mine. You're just a footnote in our story." I didn't listen. I just charged at him, fists flying. It was a blur, punch after punch, my body moving on pure instinct. But Mark wasn't helpless. He fought back, and soon we were both on the floor, struggling for control. But then, something changed. I saw the look in his eyes, something dark and triumphant. And that's when I realized I wasn't just fighting for Sarah anymore. I was fighting for something far worse. My own pride. My own need to prove that I was in control, that I could still protect her. The fight didn't last long. I could see it in his face. He was enjoying this. Enjoying watching me break, watching me lose myself in the chaos. When I finally got up, my body bruised and bloodied, I realized something. Mark didn't care about winning. He didn't care about Sarah or me. He was playing a game, and we were both caught in it. But the real question now was, did Sarah even want to be saved? As I left the apartment, my heart heavy with doubt, I felt the walls closing in on me. Mark was always going to be there, always going to be a part of our lives. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape the hold he had on her. And the more I fought, the more I wondered, was it worth it? The night after my confrontation with Mark, I couldn't shake the image of his smug face. His eyes had burned with satisfaction, as if he knew exactly what he was doing to me. It wasn't just a physical fight. It was a battle for my dignity, my sense of self, my marriage. And I wasn't sure I was winning. I walked into the house, my knuckles aching, my body sore from the brutal exchange. Sarah was sitting in the living room, her face drawn, her eyes red from crying. She had been waiting for me. "John, where have you been?" Her voice trembled, and her eyes locked onto the bruises on my face. Her expression was a mixture of concern and guilt. "I went to see him," I said coldly, wiping my bloodied hands on my jeans. "I'm done pretending this is just something we can talk through." She looked like she was going to say something, but then she simply stood up, her eyes full of remorse. "I never wanted this, John. I never wanted you to get hurt. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't listen to another apology that felt like it came too late." "Then why didn't you stop? Why did you let him manipulate you? Why did you let him get into our lives like this?" Her eyes filled with tears. She stepped toward me, but I took a step back. I couldn't let her touch me, not now. "I was weak," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I was so lost. And I—" "Stop," I said, my voice sharp. "I don't want to hear it. I turned away from her, my heart sinking with every step. The walls that had already been slowly building between us were now impossible to ignore. I grabbed my jacket, slamming the door behind me as I stepped out into the night. I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. The air felt too thick, too suffocating. I needed space. I needed to think. The night was cold, the city streets almost empty, the dim lights casting long shadows on the pavement. I walked aimlessly, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts I couldn't grasp. Mark had won. He'd won in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. But the hardest truth I was facing now was realizing I wasn't just fighting him. I was fighting against the distance Sarah and I had created between us. When did it start? When did we stop seeing each other the way we once did? Was I too wrapped up in my own battles to notice the cracks forming in our relationship? I found myself standing in front of a bar, the neon lights flickering above. Without thinking, I walked in. It was noisy, filled with people laughing, talking, drinking. It wasn't the kind of place I usually went, but tonight I didn't care. I sat at the bar, ordering a drink, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I was trying to drown the feelings I couldn't escape. Or maybe I just needed something to numb the overwhelming pain of betrayal. As I stared into my glass, I heard the sound of someone sitting down beside me. I didn't look up, but I could feel their presence, a weight beside me that seemed to draw my attention. "Bad night?" a voice asked, soft and calm. I looked up. It was a woman, someone I didn't recognize. She had dark hair, dark eyes, and a kind expression, though there was something almost familiar about her. "You could say that," I muttered, trying to focus on my drink instead of the strange sense of connection I felt. She smiled faintly, her eyes scanning my face. "You're not the first person to have a bad night in this place," she said. "But if you want to talk about it, I'm all ears." I shook my head, not trusting myself to say anything. The truth was, I didn't know what I was feeling. Anger, confusion, frustration. It all mixed together, tangled in a way that made it hard to separate one emotion from another. But she didn't press me. Instead, she ordered a drink for herself and sat there quietly, as if waiting for me to speak. And I couldn't help but wonder why I was letting a stranger see me like this, letting her see the side of me I had kept hidden for so long. "I don't know what to do anymore," I finally admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "With your wife?" she asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, not sure how to explain everything, not sure if I could. "You're hurt," she said softly, her voice surprisingly understanding. "But you're also angry, and that anger can cloud everything. Sometimes, it's hard to tell the difference between wanting to fix something and wanting to punish the person who broke it." Her words cut through me like a knife. "I don't know if I want to fix it," I said, more to myself than to her. "I don't know if there's anything left to fix." The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a sip of her drink, her eyes never leaving me. "You've been through a lot, and I don't know your whole story. But I think you need to make sure you're not fighting for something that was never yours to begin with. Sometimes it's not the fight that matters. It's whether or not you're willing to let go." Her words hung in the air long after she finished speaking. Let go. It was a thought I hadn't considered. I had been so consumed by holding on, by fighting for something that felt like it was slipping through my fingers, that I hadn't stopped to think about what would happen if I stopped fighting. Could I really walk away from everything I had fought for? From Sarah? From our life together? The question echoed in my mind, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was uncertain. I spent the next few days lost in my thoughts, trapped between the anger that had fueled my fight and the doubt creeping into my mind. Sarah was trying, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was permanently broken between us. She had apologized again, her voice trembling with sincerity, but I had learned by now that words meant little when actions had already betrayed them. Every time she reached for me, I pulled away, the distance between us growing wider with every touch, every attempt at reconciliation. I saw her face change when she realized I wasn't going to change my mind. Her eyes were no longer filled with hope. They were filled with a painful acceptance. "You're done, aren't you?" she asked one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. Could I say the words out loud? Could I admit to myself that the fight wasn't worth it anymore? Yes, I finally said, the weight of the truth crushing me. I'm done. And just like that, everything between us seemed to collapse. The love we had once shared, the life we had built, all of it seemed like a distant memory now. Sarah's tears were the only thing left. But even they felt too late. I walked away. The days after I left Sarah felt like I was living in a fog. The house, once filled with laughter and conversations, now seemed empty. Her absence weighed heavily on me, but it wasn't the kind of emptiness that begged for her return. It was a silence that felt final, a silence that echoed the choice I had made. I found myself in places I didn't recognize. Bars, empty streets, the same places I had walked through 100 times before, but now they felt different. I couldn't escape the feeling that my life had become a ghost of what it once was. I kept thinking about Sarah, about what could have been, about the years we spent together. Was it all a lie? Had she truly loved me? Or had I just been someone to fill a space in her life until Mark came along? The uncertainty gnawed at me. I thought I had made the right choice, but now I wasn't so sure. Maybe walking away wasn't the answer. Maybe I should have fought harder, done more. But when I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face. And I knew deep down that I had done what I needed to. He would always be there, lurking in the shadows, pulling her back whenever she faltered. And I couldn't keep fighting against that. The hardest part, though, was realizing that maybe Sarah didn't need me to fight for her anymore. I made the decision to move on. Slowly, painfully, but I moved forward. As I walked away from everything I had once known, I couldn't help but wonder if I made the right choice. Letting go is never easy, especially when your heart still holds on to what you thought was love. But sometimes, it's not about fighting to hold on. It's about knowing when it's time to let go. If you're still unsure whether it was the right thing to do, you're not alone. So many of us face the pain of betrayal, the battle for something that might never come back, and the struggle to find peace after everything falls apart. But one thing I've learned is that you can't change the past. All we can do is learn from it, grow from it, and eventually move forward, no matter how hard it seems. So what do you think? Was it worth it to keep fighting for love that wasn't meant to be? Or was walking away the only choice left? I want to hear your thoughts. Share your story or leave a comment below. Let's talk about what we would have done in this situation, what we might have learned from it. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Stay with me on this journey, because there's always more to these stories. More twists, more turns, and more questions we all need answers to. You never know what's coming next, and I can't wait to share it with you. So, don't forget to hit that bell for notifications, and I'll see you in the next one. Remember, you're not alone. Let's keep the conversation going.